The California sun beat down mercilessly on the tarmac at Travis Air Force Base as Captain Sarah Mitchell stepped out of the administrative building, her transfer orders still warm in her hand. The smell of jet fuel and hot asphalt filled her nostrils, a scent she'd grown to love over 10 years of service. Before her stood Hangar 7, where rows of massive C-17 Globemaster III cargo aircraft gleamed like sleeping giants. This was it, her new assignment, her fresh start. Or so she'd hoped. Sarah adjusted her flight cap and squared her shoulders, feeling the weight of her flight bag against her hip. At 32 years old, she'd logged over 3,000 flight hours, earned 2 air medals, and survived countless missions that would make lesser pilots break into cold sweats. Yet as she walked toward the hangar, that familiar knot formed in her stomach, the one that appeared every time she had to prove herself all over again. The hangar was bustling with activity. Mechanics crawled over aircraft like ants, their tools clanging against metal. The roar of a jet engine being tested somewhere in the distance created a constant backdrop of noise. Sarah scanned the area, looking for the operations office, when she heard it. Laughter. Not the warm, welcoming kind. The dismissive, mocking kind that she'd heard too many times before. "You've got to be kidding me." Sarah turned toward the voice. A group of pilots stood near one of the C-17s, their flight suits crisp, their attitudes unmistakable. At the center stood a man who could only be Colonel James Hartwick. Even from a distance, his presence commanded attention. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair cut military short, and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. His arms were crossed over his chest, and his eyes, sharp and cold, were fixed directly on her. "They're sending girls to fly my cargo planes now." His voice carried across the hangar, loud enough to ensure everyone heard. Sarah felt every eye turn toward her. The mechanics stopped working. Junior officers paused mid-conversation. Even the civilian contractors seemed to freeze. The hangar, which moments ago had been filled with productive noise, suddenly felt oppressively silent except for the distant engine roar. She recognized this moment. She'd lived it before, in Oklahoma when she first announced she wanted to fly, in flight school when instructors questioned whether she had the physical strength for military aviation, in her first squadron when a captain told her she was taking a spot from a more deserving male pilot. Each time, she'd had to make a choice, retreat or advance. Sarah had never been good at retreating. She kept walking, her boots echoing with each deliberate step. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her face remained impassive, a skill she'd perfected over years of enduring these moments. As she approached, she could see Colonel Hartwick more clearly. His face wore a smirk that made her blood boil, a look that said he'd already judged her, tried her, and found her wanting. "Colonel Hartwick, I presume," Sarah said when she reached him, her voice steady and professional. She extended her hand. He looked at her hand as if she were offering him something distasteful, then slowly, deliberately shook it. His grip was crushing, a test, she knew. She matched his pressure without flinching, maintaining eye contact. His smirk wavered slightly. "Captain Mitchell," he said, dropping her hand, "your reputation precedes you." "Does it, sir?" Sarah kept her tone neutral, though she knew exactly what he meant. Her reputation preceded her the same way her gender did, as a talking point, a controversy, a diversity checkbox that old guard officers resented. 2 air medals, top marks from your previous outstanding evaluations. He paused, his eyes narrowing. "Makes me wonder what strings were pulled to get you here." The pilots behind him chuckled. Sarah recognized the type. They weren't necessarily bad men, but they were followers, taking their cues from their commander. If Hartwick doubted her, they would too. If he dismissed her, they'd join the chorus. "No strings, sir," Sarah replied evenly. "Just 10 years of hard work and a love for flying." "Love for flying," Hartwick repeated, as if tasting the words and finding them sour. "That's sweet, Captain, really. But this isn't a civilian flying club. These are $100 million aircraft carrying critical cargo, often into hostile territory. Lives depend on split-second decisions and raw physical strength. Do you understand what I'm saying? Sarah understood perfectly. He was questioning whether she, a woman, had what it took. Never mind her decade of service. Never mind her commendations. Never mind that she'd landed C-130s on dirt strips in Iraq during sandstorms, or that she'd flown humanitarian missions into earthquake zones where the runways were cracked and crumbling. "With all due respect, sir," Sarah said, her voice taking on a subtle edge, "I've been flying military cargo aircraft for 6 years. I've logged missions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and disaster zones across 3 continents. My physical qualifications are documented and exceed requirements. If you'd like to review my complete service record, I'm happy to provide it." Hartwick's jaw tightened. For a moment Sarah thought he might explode, but he was too smart, too careful. Instead, he smiled, a thin, cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I've read your file, Captain. Very impressive, on paper." He emphasized those last 2 words. But paper and reality are 2 different things. In my Air Force, and make no mistake, this is my base, my hangar, my aircraft, pilots earn their place. Not through quotas or political correctness, but through demonstrated excellence under my watch. "I wouldn't want it any other way, sir," Sarah said. "Good." Hartwick gestured toward the C-17 behind him. "Because you'll get plenty of opportunities to demonstrate that excellence. I'll be watching every move you make, Captain. Every landing, every decision, every flight. Understood?" "Understood, sir." "Dismissed." Sarah saluted, received his perfunctory salute in return, and walked past him toward the operations office. She could feel his eyes boring into her back, could hear the murmured conversations resuming behind her, could sense the doubt, the skepticism, the anticipation of her failure. She climbed the metal stairs to the operations office, opened the door, and stepped inside. Only then, alone in the corridor, did she allow herself a moment. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and let her shoulders sag slightly. This was going to be harder than she'd thought. But Sarah Mitchell hadn't come this far to give up now. She'd faced men like Hartwick before, men who saw her gender before they saw her skill, who heard female pilot and assumed weakness. She'd proven them wrong every single time. As she straightened her uniform and headed deeper into the building, one thought crystallized in her mind. Colonel Hartwick was about to learn the same lesson all the others had. She wasn't here to meet his expectations. She was here to shatter them. 3 months, 91 days, 2,184 hours. That's how long Sarah had been under Colonel Hartwick's microscope, and she felt every single second of it. She sat in the briefing room at 600 hours, coffee growing cold in her hand, watching as Hartwick assigned the day's missions. Around her, 15 pilots waited with varying degrees of alertness. Some slouched in their chairs, others checked their phones discreetly. Sarah sat ramrod straight, notepad ready, though she already knew what was coming. "Captain Richardson," Hartwick said, pointing to a tall, sandy-haired pilot who'd arrived at Travis 2 weeks after Sarah. "You'll take the C-17 to Ramstein. Medical supplies and personnel. Weather's tricky, low ceiling over the Atlantic, but I know you can handle it." Richardson nodded confidently. He'd logged 1,200 hours total, half Sarah's experience. "Captain Torres, you've got the VIP run to D.C. Senator Mitchum and his staff. White glove service, gentlemen." Hartwick smiled. Torres, with 900 hours, grinned back. Sarah's pen tapped against her notepad. Tap, tap, tap. "Major Kendrick, the combat zone supply run to Al Udeid is yours. Cargo includes ammunition and tactical equipment. High priority mission." Kendrick pumped his fist. "Yes, sir. 800 hours of flight time." Finally, Hartwick's eyes landed on Sarah. The room seemed to collectively hold its breath. In 3 months, this had become a ritual, everyone waiting to see what scraps Hartwick would throw her way. "Captain Mitchell." His voice dripped with feigned professionalism. "Routine cargo to Fort Hood. Rations, office supplies, replacement parts. Basic, straightforward, impossible to screw up, even for you. Someone coughed to cover a laugh. Sarah's jaw clenched, but her voice remained steady. Understood, sir. One more thing, Captain. Hartwick shuffled papers on his podium. I'll need your post-flight report by 1800 hours. Detailed. I want fuel consumption analysis, approach patterns, and a complete equipment assessment. 3 copies. Sir, Sarah caught herself. None of the other pilots were required to submit such extensive reports. Yes, sir. Problem, Captain? No, sir. Hartwick's smile was razor-thin. Excellent, dismissed. The pilots filed out, and Sarah felt the familiar isolation close around her. Most avoided eye contact. Some whispered as they passed. Only one person waited for her in the corridor, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, her assigned co-pilot. At 24, he was fresh from training, with barely 200 hours in the C-17. Initially, he'd been terrified of flying with her, convinced that Hartwick's obvious disdain meant she was incompetent. 3 months had changed his mind completely. Another thrilling day of flying meals ready to eat across Texas, Marcus said, falling into step beside her. My aviation dreams are truly being fulfilled. Despite everything, Sarah smiled. At least it's flying. Sarah, this is ridiculous. Marcus lowered his voice as they walked toward the flight line. You're the best pilot on this base, and everyone knows it except the one person who matters. Richardson almost bounced his landing yesterday. I was in the tower and heard ground control cursing. Torres got lost on his way to Andrews last week. Lost, with GPS and Kendrick. He shook his head. Kendrick's a good guy, but he's not ready for combat zone work. You are. You've done it dozens of times. It doesn't matter what I've done before, Marcus. It only matters what I do here, under Hartwick's watch. But he won't give you the chance to prove yourself. How can you show what you're capable of when he only assigns you milk runs? Sarah stopped walking and turned to face him. Around them, the morning sun glinted off aircraft canopies. The smell of jet fuel hung in the air like perfume. Listen to me carefully, she said. I've been the first woman in every unit I've served in, every single one, and at every posting there's been a Colonel Hartwick. Different names, different faces, same attitude. You know what I've learned. Marcus waited. They're waiting for you to fail, hopping for it even. So you can't give them anything, not one mistake, not one moment of weakness, not one excuse to say, see, I told you so. That means every routine flight has to be perfect. Every boring milk run becomes an opportunity to be flawless. That's not fair. Fair, Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. Marcus, when I landed my first C-130 in Kandahar under mortar fire, my aircraft commander told me I did pretty good for a girl. When I received my first air medal, 3 pilots filed complaints saying it was politically motivated. When I applied for this posting, my previous who gave me outstanding evaluations, still felt compelled to assure Travis that I wasn't too emotional for cargo operations. She paused. Fair has nothing to do with it. Marcus looked at the ground, processing. When he looked up, his young face was set with determination. Then I'll tell them. I'll tell Hartwick that you're the best I've flown with. Marcus, no. But he was already walking toward the admin building. 2 hours later, Sarah was completing her pre-flight inspection when Marcus returned. His face was flushed, his jaw tight. What happened? She asked, though she already knew. I told him. I told Colonel Hartwick that you're an exceptional pilot, that your technique is textbook perfect, that I've learned more in 3 months with you than in my entire training program. Sarah closed her eyes, and he said, Marcus's voice shook with barely contained anger. He said, then you haven't flown with many pilots, Lieutenant. Maybe I should assign you to someone more experienced so you can learn what real flying looks like. Of course he did. Sarah placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. Thank you for trying, I mean that. It's not right, Sarah. None of this is right. No, she agreed. It's not. But here's what we're going to do. We're going to fly to Fort Hood. We're going to deliver those rations and office supplies with a landing so smooth that passengers won't spill their coffee. We're going to complete that absurd report Hartwick demanded, and it's going to be so thorough, so detailed, so perfect that he won't find a single thing to criticize. And then tomorrow we'll do it again. And the day after that. And the day after that. For how long? Sarah looked up at the C-17 towering above them, its massive frame somehow graceful despite its size. She thought about all the flights she'd made, all the doubters she'd silenced, all the barriers she'd broken. For as long as it takes, she said quietly. Because eventually, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next month, but eventually, Hartwick will have no choice but to give me a real mission. A mission that matters, a mission that's difficult. And when he does... She turned to Marcus, and he saw something fierce burning in her eyes. When he does, I'm going to show him exactly what this girl can do. That night Sarah sat alone in her quarters completing Hartwick's report. 3 copies, single-spaced, analyzing every minute detail of a routine 2-hour flight. It was busy work designed to frustrate and demean her. She knew it. He knew it. Everyone knew it. But as she typed the final paragraph, describing optimal fuel consumption patterns at various altitudes, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Hartwick thought he was breaking her down. He was actually building her up. Every mundane flight she perfected was another round in her arsenal. Every excessive report was more documentation of her excellence. Every impossible standard he set was another one she met and exceeded. The colonel was creating his own nightmare, a pilot so precise, so skilled, so undeniably competent that when the moment came, when the mission arose that no one else could fly, he would have no choice but to call on her. Sarah hit print and leaned back in her chair. "Keep watching, Colonel," she whispered to the empty room, "because I'm just getting started." September 27th started like any other Friday evening. Sarah had just finished her 3rd consecutive day of routine cargo runs, this time hauling vehicle parts to Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. She'd submitted her detailed report to Colonel Hartwick an hour before the deadline, showered away the day's exhaustion, and settled into her quarters with a worn paperback novel and a cup of chamomile tea. Outside her window, Travis Air Force Base was winding down for the night. The constant roar of aircraft engines had softened to an occasional rumble. Distant voices and laughter from the officers' club drifted on the evening breeze. Sarah had been invited. Captain Torres was celebrating his birthday, but she declined. 3 months of isolation had taught her that forced socializing only made the awkwardness worse. She was halfway through Chapter 7, just reaching the good part when her cell phone shattered the quiet. The ringtone, reserved for base operations, sent adrenaline spiking through her system. She checked the clock. 11:47 p.m. Nothing good happened at 11:47 p.m. "Captain Mitchell," she answered, already on her feet. "Captain, this is Major Reynolds at operations." His voice was tight, stressed. "We need you here immediately. Emergency briefing. How fast can you get here?" Sarah was already pulling on her flight suit. 5 minutes. "Make it 3. The line went dead. Sarah's mind raced as she drove through the darkened base, her headlights cutting through the California night. Emergency briefing. Immediate response. This wasn't routine. This was real. Her heart hammered with a mixture of fear, and she had to admit, excitement. After 3 months of delivering office supplies and filing excessive reports, something significant was finally happening. But the fear was there too. Emergency briefings at midnight meant someone was in trouble, possibly dying, possibly dead. She parked outside the operations building and sprinted up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. The hallway lights were harsh after the darkness outside. Through the briefing room door, she could see figures moving, hear urgent voices. Sarah pushed through. The room was packed. Major Reynolds stood at the front near a large monitor displaying satellite imagery. Captain Richardson and Major Kendrick were there, both in civilian clothes, both shaking their heads. Several operations officers clustered around tablets and computers. The energy in the room was electric with crisis. And in the corner, arms crossed, face unreadable, Colonel Hartwick. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second before Reynolds noticed her arrival. "Captain Mitchell, thank you for coming so quickly." Reynolds gestured to the screen. "We have a situation. A diplomatic security convoy in Afghanistan was hit by an IED approximately 2 hours ago. 7 casualties, all critical. They need immediate medical evacuation to Ramstein Air Base in Germany, where trauma surgeons are standing by." Sarah moved closer to the screen, studying the satellite images. "What's the extraction point?" "Bagram Airfield." Her stomach tightened. Bagram, she knew it well, had flown in and out a dozen times during her previous posting, but that was years ago. "Current conditions?" she asked. Reynolds pulled up a weather display, and the room seemed to grow colder. A massive storm system dominated the screen, swirling in angry red and orange patterns directly over Afghanistan. "A freak weather system moved in faster than predicted," Reynolds explained. "Current conditions at Bagram: winds gusting to 60 knots, visibility near zero, active lightning, severe turbulence reported at all altitudes. It's a nightmare scenario." "It's a suicide mission," Richardson interjected. He looked at Sarah apologetically. "I've got 2 kids at home. I can't. I'm sorry, but I can't take this one." Reynolds nodded curtly. "Understood." He turned to Kendrick. "Major." Kendrick ran a hand through his hair, looking miserable. "Sir, my wife just had surgery yesterday. I'm her only caregiver right now. If something happened to me—" He trailed off. "I understand," Reynolds said, though his frustration was evident. He turned to Sarah, and in that moment she saw the desperation in his eyes. "Captain Mitchell, I know this is beyond anything we've asked of you. The weather alone makes this incredibly dangerous. Intelligence also reports possible hostile activity in the area, but those 7 soldiers have maybe 6 hours before—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah stepped closer to the weather display, her mind automatically calculating risk factors. Wind shear, 0 visibility, hostile territory, unknown aircraft serviceability at Bagram, fuel considerations for a Europe-bound flight. Every rational part of her brain was screaming that this was insane. "Who's been offered this mission?" she asked quietly. Reynolds hesitated. "Richardson, Kendrick, Torres. He's on leave in Florida, and Thompson, who's down with the flu. You're our last option." Last option, of course she was. Sarah studied the satellite image of Bagram, remembering her flights there. The runway configuration, the approach patterns, the mountains lurking in the darkness around the airfield. She thought about 7 soldiers bleeding, dying, waiting for salvation that might never come. From the corner, Hartwick's voice cut through her thoughts. "Captain Mitchell, no one would blame you for declining. As Major Reynolds said, this is extraordinarily dangerous. Given your limited experience with this type of mission at Travis, it would be completely understandable if you felt it was beyond your capabilities." Sarah turned to face him. In 3 months, she'd learned to read Hartwick's expressions. Right now, he wore the look of a man who'd already written the ending to this story. Her refusal, her admission of inadequacy, his vindication. He was giving her an out. A perfectly reasonable, completely justified excuse to say no. And he expected her to take it. Sarah looked back at the weather display, at the swirling chaos that stood between those wounded soldiers and survival. She thought about every routine flight she'd flown perfectly, every excessive report she'd completed flawlessly, every dismissive comment she'd endured silently. 3 months of proving herself with milk runs and office supplies. This was what she'd been waiting for, the mission that mattered, the moment that counted. It was also potentially suicide. "I'll take it," Sarah said. The room went still. "Captain, are you certain?" Reynolds asked. I need you to understand." "I understand completely, sir." Sarah's voice was firm, clear. "Those soldiers need immediate evacuation. The weather is dangerous but not impossible. I've flown in severe conditions before. I've landed at Bagram multiple times. I can do this." Reynolds exhaled, relief flooding his face. "Thank you, Captain. Pre-flight briefing in 10 minutes. We'll have a crew assembled and—" "I want Lieutenant Webb as my co-pilot," Sarah interrupted. "And I need the best loadmaster we have on duty." "Done. Tech Sergeant Morrison is already prepping the aircraft." Sarah nodded and turned toward the door, her mind already shifting into mission mode. She needed to review current intelligence reports, check weather updates, plan her approach strategy. "Captain Mitchell." Hartwick's voice stopped her at the door. She turned. He stood away from the others, his face harder to read than usual. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear. "7 lives are depending on you," he said. "Don't let your ego write checks your skills can't cash." Sarah held his gaze. "With respect, sir, this isn't about ego. It's about 7 soldiers who deserve every chance at survival, and I'm going to give them that chance." She walked out without waiting for his response. Behind her in the briefing room, Colonel Hartwick stood motionless, watching her go. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched. Major Reynolds approached him cautiously. "Sir, she's our best option. Her record—" "I know her record, Major." Hartwick's voice was barely above a whisper. He stared at the weather display, at the impossible conditions Mitchell would be flying into. "I also know that in 30 years of military aviation, I've seen veteran pilots with twice her experience refuse missions less dangerous than this." "Then why did she accept?" Hartwick was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something that might have been respect or might have been fear. "Because she has something to prove," he said quietly. "The question is whether she'll live long enough to prove it." C-17 Globemaster sat on the tarmac like a sleeping beast, its massive frame illuminated by harsh floodlights. Sarah completed her external inspection with methodical precision, her flashlight beam tracing every rivet, every panel, every critical system. At 2:45 hours, the base was eerily quiet except for the hum of ground power units and the distant barking of security dogs. "Fuel tanks topped off, ma'am," Tech Sergeant James Morrison reported, clipboard in hand. At 42, Morrison was a legend among loadmasters, calm under fire, meticulous in his work, and completely unflappable. When Sarah had requested him specifically, he'd simply nodded and said, "Heard you're flying into hell. Sounds like Tuesday." "Thanks, Morrison. How's she looking?" "Aircraft solid. Fresh hydraulics, new tires, engines purring like kittens." He paused. "It's not the bird I'm worried about, Captain." Sarah followed his gaze upward. Even here in California, clouds were rolling in, blotting out the stars. The storm system they'd be flying into stretched across half of Asia. "We'll be fine," she said with more confidence than she felt. "Yes, ma'am." Morrison headed up the cargo ramp. "If you say so, I believe you." Sarah climbed into the cockpit where Lieutenant Marcus Webb was already running through pre-flight checks, his young face set with concentration. When he heard her footsteps, he looked up. "I pulled the weather updates," he said quietly. "Sarah, it's getting worse. Bagram is reporting winds at 65 knots now. 65, that's hurricane force." Sarah settled into the left seat, her hands automatically finding the familiar controls. "What's the forecast trend?" "Deteriorating for the next 6 hours, then clearing rapidly. If we could delay." "Those soldiers don't have 6 hours, Marcus." She began her cockpit inspection, fingers dancing over switches and instruments. "We go now, or we don't go at all." Marcus was silent for a moment, then resumed his checklist. They worked in synchronized efficiency, 2 pilots becoming 1 crew. Outside, ground crews disconnected power and removed wheel chocks. At exactly 300 hours, Sarah keyed the radio. Travis Tower, Eagle 17, ready for taxi. Eagle 17, Travis Tower cleared to taxi runway 21. Winds calm, altimeter 3012. A pause. Good luck out there, Captain. Sarah heard something in the controller's voice. Concern, respect, maybe even admiration. Thanks, Tower. Eagle 17 rolling. The massive aircraft lurched forward, all 282,500 pounds of it responding to her touch. They taxied through the darkness, past rows of silent aircraft, past hangars where mechanics had stopped to watch them leave. In the control tower, Colonel Hartwick stood with his coffee growing cold, watching the C-17's lights move across the airfield. Major Reynolds stood beside him. "Sir, you should go home. There's nothing you can do from here." Hartwick didn't move. "I'll stay until they're wheels up." On the runway, Sarah pushed the throttles forward. 4 Pratt & Whitney engines roared to life, 40,440 pounds of thrust each, shaking the aircraft with barely contained power. "Airspeed alive," Marcus called out. 80 knots, 100, VR. Sarah pulled back on the yoke, and the C-17 lifted gracefully into the night sky. The base fell away beneath them, a grid of lights growing smaller. California's coastline glittered in the distance. "Positive rate," Marcus confirmed. "Gear up." "Gear up," Sarah repeated, her hand steady. Eagle 17, Travis departure, radar contact. Climb and maintain flight level 350. Safe flight. Roger, departure, climbing to 350. The lights of California disappeared behind them as they banked eastward. Ahead lay thousands of miles of darkness, an ocean, a continent, and a storm that could tear them from the sky. 5 hours passed in relative calm. They crossed the Pacific, refueled from a KC-135 tanker over Japan, and pressed on toward Afghanistan. Sarah and Marcus traded control in shifts, though Sarah found sleep impossible. She reviewed approach plates for bagram, calculated fuel reserves, and monitored weather updates that grew increasingly grim. Morrison brought them coffee and protein bars. "Getting bumpy back here," he reported. "We're hitting the edge of it." He was right. Turbulence began as gentle shudders, then progressed to stomach-dropping jolts. Sarah disengaged the autopilot and took manual control. In severe weather, she trusted her hands more than computers. "Travis Command, this is Eagle 17, she radioed. "Entering Afghan airspace. Requesting current bagram conditions." Back at Travis, where dawn was breaking, Colonel Hartwick had never left the tower. He grabbed the microphone before anyone else could respond. "Eagle 17, Travis Command actual." His voice was tight. "Bagram conditions are critical. Winds gusting to 70 knots with severe crosswind component. Visibility 1/4 mile in heavy rain. Multiple lightning strikes reported. Recommend divert to Kandahar airfield." Sarah glanced at Marcus, whose face had gone pale. "Travis Command, what's Kandahar weather?" "Better but not great. Manageable conditions. You could land, wait out the storm, then proceed to Bagram." Sarah did the math in her head. Divert to Kandahar, wait for the weather, fly to Bagram, load casualties, then to Germany. She checked her fuel calculations. "Travis Command, that adds 4 hours minimum to evacuation time. Medical says our casualties are critical now. 4 hours is too long." In the tower, Hartwick closed his eyes. He knew she was right. He also knew what he was about to ask her to do. "Eagle 17, understood. The decision is yours, Captain, but I need you to know what you're facing. In 30 years, I've only seen a handful of landings attempted in conditions like this. Most ended badly." The cockpit fell silent except for the roar of engines and the increasing violence of turbulence. Rain began hammering the windscreen. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating towering thunderheads that looked like mountains of rage. "Marcus," Sarah said quietly, "your call. If you want to divert to Kandahar, I'll support that decision. No judgment, no shame." Marcus stared out at the storm, his hands gripping his armrests. He thought about his family back home, about the life he was risking. Then he thought about 7 soldiers bleeding out on a tarmac, their hope fading with every passing minute. Those soldiers didn't get a choice about being hit by an IED, he said finally. We do get a choice about whether to help them. I say we go in. Sarah felt a surge of pride. Morrison. The loadmaster's voice came through the intercom. I'm strapped in back here, ma'am. Whatever you decide, I'm with you. Sarah took a deep breath. This was it. The moment. Not another milk run or routine cargo haul. This was life or death, glory or disaster, vindication or failure. She thought about Colonel Hartwick in the tower, watching, waiting for her to fail. She thought about every doubt, every dismissal, every condescending comment. But mostly, she thought about 7 human beings who deserved every chance at survival. Travis Command, Eagle 17, were proceeding to Bagram. Silence on the radio. Then Hartwick's voice, barely audible, copy Eagle 17, Godspeed. They punched into the storm system at 32,000 feet, and the world exploded into chaos. The aircraft bucked like a wild animal. Rain hammered the windscreen so hard it sounded like gravel. Lightning strobed through the cockpit, momentarily blinding. Jesus, Marcus shouted as they dropped 300 feet in an air pocket. Sarah fought the controls, her muscles straining. Every instinct screamed to turn back. But ahead, somewhere in that maelstrom of wind and rain and lightning, 7 soldiers waited. Bagram Tower, Eagle 17, 50 miles out, requesting approach clearance, Sarah transmitted, her voice somehow steady despite the violence around them. Eagle 17, Bagram Tower. The controller's voice was strained. Sir, are you sure about this? We can't even see our own runway. Winds are now gusting to 75 knots. Sarah's hands gripped the yoke tighter. Bagram, Eagle 17 is committed. We're coming in. Behind her, Morrison whispered a prayer. Beside her, Marcus checked their altitude, passing 20,000 feet, starting descent. And in California, Colonel Hartwick stood frozen in the tower, his coffee cup forgotten in his hand, listening to a woman he doubted fly deliberately into hell. She's really doing it, someone whispered. Hartwick couldn't speak. He could only listen and watch the radar screen as that single blip descended toward Bagram. Toward destiny. The descent began at 20,000 feet, and that's when Sarah realized this wasn't just dangerous, it was potentially impossible. The C-17 dropped through layers of turbulence that felt like invisible fists punching the aircraft from every direction. Sarah's arms ached from fighting the controls, every muscle engaged in a constant battle against nature's fury. Rain sheeted across the windscreen so thick that the wipers were useless. Lightning crackled around them, close enough that she could smell ozone in the cockpit. 15,000 feet, Marcus called out, his voice tight. Airspeed fluctuating, 195 knots, 240-180. The airspeed indicator was going crazy, swinging wildly as they hit pockets of wind shear. Sarah's eyes darted between instruments, her brain processing a dozen inputs simultaneously. Altitude, airspeed, vertical speed, heading, attitude, everything was unstable. Bagram Tower, Eagle 17, passing 15,000, requesting updated conditions, Sarah transmitted. Static filled the radio then. Eagle 17, conditions unchanged. Visibility 1/4 mile. Wind 270 at 65, gusting to 80. Recommend go-around. 80 knots, that was 92 miles per hour of wind, crosswind. Negative Bagram, continuing approach. At Travis Air Force Base, the control tower was packed. Word had spread that Captain Mitchell was attempting the impossible. Pilots who should have been sleeping stood shoulder to shoulder, listening to the radio transmissions. The tension was suffocating. Colonel Hartwick hadn't moved from his position. His knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the console. Major Reynolds stood beside him, watching the radar screen where Eagle 17's blip descended in jerky increments. "Sir, maybe we should order her to abort," Reynolds suggested quietly. Hartwick shook his head slowly. "She's beyond the decision point. If she tries to climb back through this storm." He didn't finish. They both knew attempting to climb back through severe turbulence with low fuel was suicide. Mitchell was committed. She'd go down or land. There was no third option. 10,000 feet, Marcus reported. His voice cracked slightly. "Sarah, the runway, we're not going to be able to see it until we're right on top of it." "I know." Sarah's jaw was set, her eyes fixed on the instruments. She was flying entirely on gauges now, trusting the numbers more than her senses. Outside, everything was gray chaos. Whump! The aircraft dropped 500 feet in an instant. Sarah's stomach lurched into her throat. Marcus gasped. In the back, Morrison's prayer grew louder. "Wind shear," Sarah shouted, shoving the throttles forward. The engine screamed, fighting to recover the lost altitude. "Come on, baby, climb." The C-17 clawed its way back up, engines howling at maximum power. Sarah's heart hammered so hard she could hear it over the storm. 8,000 feet. We're back on glide path. Alarms began sounding. First one, then another. Overspeed warning, terrain warning, wind shear caution. The cockpit was a cacophony of electronic screams, all of them saying the same thing: "You're going to die." Sarah's hands moved with surgical precision, silencing alarms, adjusting power, trimming the aircraft. Sweat ran down her face despite the cold. Beside her, Marcus was calling out altitudes and airspeeds, his voice the only anchor in the chaos. 6,000 feet, 5,000, 4,000. Bagram Tower, Eagle 17, 4 miles out. Where's the runway? Eagle 17, runway 21, winds 270 at 70, gusting to 85. You have a 55-knot crosswind component, sir. This is beyond safe landing parameters. You need to go around. 55-knot crosswind. Sarah had never landed in anything close to that. The maximum demonstrated crosswind for a C-17 was 33 knots. She was attempting nearly double that. In conditions where she couldn't even see the runway. "Negative Bagram, we're landing." Crack! Lightning struck so close that the windscreen lit up white. Thunder exploded around them, shaking the airframe. Every instrument panel flickered and died for 2 terrifying seconds before backup systems kicked in. "Electrical hit," Marcus yelled. "Checking systems, backup navigation online, primary instruments restored, we're okay." 3,000 feet. They broke through the cloud base, and what Sarah saw made her blood run cold. The runway was barely visible through sheets of rain, but worse, much worse, the wind was pushing them sideways. She was pointed at the runway, but the aircraft was sliding to the left like a car on ice. At this rate, they'd miss the runway entirely. "Wind correction," Sarah barked, banking right, fighting to counteract the horrific crosswind. The C-17 flew at an extreme angle, nose pointed 30 degrees away from their actual direction of travel. In the tower at Travis, someone whispered, "She's crabbing, look at her angle." Hartwick stared at the radar screen, his face ashen. He'd flown in combat zones, through enemy fire, through mechanical failures. But he'd never attempted what Mitchell was attempting right now. 2,000 feet, Marcus called. Airspeed 150 knots, 180, 160. "Sarah, we're all over the place." "I know, stay with me, Marcus." The runway lights appeared through the rain, a line of white in the gray chaos. Sarah's entire world narrowed to those lights and her instruments. Nothing else existed. Not her career, not Hartwick's doubts, not even her own fear. Just this moment, this approach, this landing. 1,000 feet. The wind hit them from the side like a truck. The C-17 rolled 30 degrees, its right wing dipping toward the ground. Alarms screamed. Sarah hauled on the controls, using every ounce of strength to level the wings. Too low, Marcus shouted. 800 feet. Sarah adjusted power, feeling the aircraft respond sluggishly. They were heavy with fuel, fighting hurricane-force winds, and she was running out of altitude. Wind shear ahead, Bagram Tower warned. 600 feet. The aircraft bucked and twisted. Rain hammered the windscreen. Sarah's arms burned with fatigue. Her vision tunneled. Everything, her entire life, her career, Marcus's life, Morrison's life, 7 dying soldiers, everything came down to the next 30 seconds. 500 feet, Marcus's voice was barely a whisper. 400, 300. The runway was right there, visible now, but they were too far left, too fast, too high, and the crosswind was pushing them further off center. At Travis, the tower fell completely silent. 20 pilots held their collective breath. Hartwick's lips moved in what might have been a prayer. 200 feet, Marcus called out. Sarah. I see it. At 150 feet, Sarah made her decision. It was insane. It was desperate. It was the only chance they had. She kicked the right rudder hard, simultaneously rolling the left wing down. The C-17 responded, its nose swinging right, wings tilting, the entire aircraft hanging at an impossible angle as it descended through the maelstrom. What are you? Marcus began. Trust me. 100 feet, the runway rushed up. 50 feet, still crabbed at a 40-degree angle, wings tilted, fighting the wind with every control surface. 20 feet, Sarah could see individual lights, puddles of water on the concrete. 10 feet. At the last possible instant, the final second before impact, Sarah performed the most difficult maneuver in aviation. She simultaneously straightened the nose with the rudder while leveling the wings with the ailerons, transforming the aircraft from a crabbed, tilted mess into a perfectly aligned landing configuration. For one impossible moment, the C-17 hung there, perfectly aligned with the runway, wings level, nose straight. 5 feet, 3 feet, 1 foot. The main landing gear kissed the runway. Down, Sarah shouted, immediately deploying thrust reversers. Stay on center line. But they weren't done. The crosswind caught them the instant they touched, trying to push them off the runway. Sarah stood on the rudder pedals, her legs shaking with effort, keeping the nose straight while the wind tried to spin them like a weather vane. Center line, Marcus yelled. You're on center line. The aircraft slowed, 80 knots, 60 knots, 40 knots. Finally, mercifully, they came to a stop. For 3 seconds, nobody spoke. The only sound was rain hammering on the fuselage and the tick of cooling engines. Then Marcus whispered, oh my God, you did it. Sarah's hands were shaking so badly she could barely key the radio. Bagram Tower, Eagle 17 is on the deck. At Travis Air Force Base, the tower erupted in cheers. Colonel Hartwick stood motionless, staring at the radar screen where Eagle 17's blip had stopped moving on Bagram's runway. His hands were shaking. His eyes were wet. And for the first time in 30 years of military service, James Hartwick had no words. Sarah sat in the cockpit, rain drumming on the windscreen, her hands still gripping the yoke though they'd been motionless for 30 seconds. Her entire body trembled with adrenaline crash. Beside her, Marcus was breathing like he'd just run a marathon. Eagle 17, Bagram ground control. The voice on the radio sounded shaken. That was, we've never seen. Taxi to spot 3. Medical vehicles are standing by. Sarah forced her hands to release the controls. Every muscle ached. Copy ground, taxiing to spot 3. The C-17 rolled slowly through the deluge. Through the rain-streaked windows, Sarah could see a cluster of vehicles with flashing lights, ambulances, a fire truck, ground crew huddled against the storm. and 7 stretchers being loaded onto gurneys by medics moving with urgent precision. "Morrison, prepare for rapid loading," Sarah called on the intercom. "We're not staying any longer than necessary." "Already on it, Captain." Morrison's voice was steady, professional, but Sarah could hear the underlying emotion. They just survived something that should have killed them. The aircraft stopped. Morrison lowered the cargo ramp, and wind howled into the cabin. Sarah unbuckled and moved back through the cargo bay. The moment she appeared at the top of the ramp, a Bagram operations officer grabbed her arm. "Captain, that landing." His eyes were wide with something between shock and reverence. "In 20 years here, I've never seen anyone attempt that in these conditions, let alone succeed." Sarah barely heard him. Her focus was on the stretchers being loaded. 7 soldiers, some unconscious, others moaning in pain. Blood-soaked bandages, plasma bags, medics shouting medical terminology. These weren't statistics or mission parameters. These were human beings, somebody's sons and daughters fighting for their lives. A young soldier, couldn't have been more than 22, was conscious. His leg was mangled, his face pale with blood loss. As medics secured his stretcher, his eyes found Sarah's. "You flew through that," he whispered, gesturing weakly at the storm outside. "For us." Sarah knelt beside his stretcher. "Every time, soldier, every single time." His eyes filled with tears. "Thank you." A medic, a woman with captain's bars, approached Sarah. "All 7 are critical but stable. If you'd been delayed even 2 more hours." She didn't finish. She didn't need to. "How long for loading?" Sarah asked. 8 minutes. We're moving as fast as we can." Sarah nodded and returned to the cockpit where Marcus was already running pre-takeoff calculations. Fuel status: tight but manageable. Direct route to Ramstein puts us at destination with reserves just above minimum. Weather en route: clearing to the west. Once we're out of this system, we're good. Marcus paused, looking at her. "Sarah, we have to take off in this. The same conditions we just landed in." She knew. Taking off in a crosswind like this, with a full load of wounded, was almost as dangerous as the landing had been. But there was no choice. Every minute delayed was another minute those soldiers didn't have access to surgical facilities. "We'll manage," she said quietly, strapping back into her seat. 12 minutes later, Morrison had loaded in record time. They were cleared for takeoff. Sarah taxied to the runway, her mind already calculating angles and power settings. The crosswind was marginally better now, down to 60 knots, but that was still catastrophic by normal standards. "Travis Command, Eagle 17 departing Bagram with 7 precious cargo," Sarah transmitted. At Travis, Colonel Hartwick's voice came back immediately. He'd been on the radio the entire time, listening to every transmission. "Eagle 17, Travis Command. Good hunting. We're tracking you home." Sarah pushed the throttles forward. The C-17 accelerated down the runway, water spraying from its tires. At rotation speed, she pulled back and the aircraft clawed into the sky, immediately caught by the wind and pushed sideways. Sarah corrected, climbing into the storm, buffeted and battered but climbing. They broke through the weather at 18,000 feet into brilliant sunshine. The contrast was surreal. Below, gray chaos. Above, crystalline blue sky and blinding light. "We're clear," Marcus breathed. "We actually made it." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "Now we just have to get them to Germany." The flight to Ramstein Air Base took 6 hours. Sarah and Marcus traded control, both too wired to sleep. Morrison moved between the wounded, checking their status, offering water to those conscious enough to drink. The medic traveling with them, Captain Angela Torres, worked constantly, monitoring vitals, adjusting IVs, keeping her patients alive. Somewhere over the Mediterranean, Torres came forward to the cockpit. "Captain Mitchell," she had to speak loudly over the engine noise. "I wanted you to know all 7 are stable. 2 were touch and go for a while, but they're responding to treatment. Because you got us out of Bagram so fast, they're all going to make it." Sarah felt something crack in her chest, emotions she'd been holding back since the mission began. "That's good," she managed. "That's really good." Tor studied her for a moment. "That landing. I've flown on dozens of medical evacuations. I've seen plenty of pilots refuse missions for less than what you faced. You risked your life for 7 people you've never met." "It's the job," Sarah said simply. "No," Tor shook her head. "It's not. The job is flying aircraft. What you did back there, that was something else. That was heroism." After Tor's return to her patients, Marcus spoke quietly. "She's right, you know. What you did was extraordinary." Sarah stared out at the endless blue sky. "I just flew the plane, Marcus." "No," he said, echoing Tor's. "You did something else, something I'll be telling my grandkids about." They landed at Ramstein at 14:30 hours local time. Surgical teams were waiting on the tarmac, along with a small crowd of medical personnel and base operations staff. Word of the Bagram landing had spread. As the wounded were unloaded, a 2-star general approached the aircraft. Major General Richard Crawford, Ramstein's commanding officer, waited as Sarah descended from the cockpit. "Captain Mitchell," he saluted crisply. She returned it. "I've been briefed on your mission. That landing at Bagram, the conditions you faced." He paused, seeming to struggle for words. "In 35 years of military aviation, I've heard of maybe 3 or 4 landings in those conditions. Most ended in crashes. What you accomplished today will be studied in flight schools." Sarah felt her face flush. "Sir, I was just doing your job," Crawford smiled. "That's what all the great ones say. Your aircraft is being refueled. Get some rest in our facilities before your return flight." But Sarah shook her head. "With respect, sir, I'd like to get home. We've been gone 24 hours and I know people are waiting." Crawford studied her, then nodded. "Understood. Safe flight, Captain." 6 hours later, Sarah landed at Travis Air Force Base. It was 3:30 hours California time, almost exactly 24 hours since the mission had begun. She was operating on pure willpower now, exhaustion hitting her in waves. She taxied to their assigned hangar, expecting the usual empty tarmac. Instead, dozens of people waited in the pre-dawn darkness. "What the?" Marcus stared out the window. Pilots, mechanics, ground crew, operations personnel. They lined the taxiway, and as the C-17 rolled past, they began to applaud. Some saluted. Others just stood with hands over their hearts. Sarah's throat tightened. She blinked rapidly, refusing to let tears fall. She parked the aircraft, completed her shutdown procedures with Morrison's help, and finally, climbed down from the cockpit. Her legs nearly buckled. 32 hours of flying, most of it in terror-inducing conditions, had taken everything she had. The crowd kept a respectful distance, but their presence spoke volumes. These were her peers, her colleagues, people who understood exactly what she'd accomplished. And standing alone at the edge of the tarmac, separate from everyone else, was Colonel James Hartwick. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't frowning. His face was unreadable in the harsh lights. As Sarah approached, the crowd fell silent. Hartwick didn't speak immediately. He stood there, this man who'd doubted her for 3 months, who'd laughed at her, who'd assigned her only milk runs and routine cargo. His jaw worked as if he were chewing on words that tasted bitter. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he extended his hand. Sarah looked at it, then at his face. "Captain Mitchell," his voice was rough, almost hoarse. He stopped, started again. "I've been flying for 30 years. Combat zones, emergency evacuations, impossible missions. I've seen the best pilots in the Air Force operate under pressure." He paused, and Sarah saw something she'd never expected to see in Colonel James Hartwick's eyes. Humility. "What you did today," he continued, "in those conditions with that crosswind in zero visibility," his voice cracked slightly. That was the finest piece of flying I've seen in my entire career. Not just good, not just competent, the finest. The silence was absolute. I owe you an apology, Captain, a significant one. Hartwick's hand remained extended. I judged you before you had a chance to prove yourself. I let my prejudices blind me to your capabilities. I was wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. And 7 soldiers are alive tonight because you were brave enough, skilled enough, and dedicated enough to prove me wrong. Sarah stared at his hand for a long moment. 3 months of doubt, 3 months of dismissal, 3 months of having to be perfect just to be considered adequate. But she also thought about those 7 soldiers, about Marcus's loyalty, about Tor's respect, about the crowd behind her who understood what she'd accomplished. She reached out and shook Hartwick's hand. Apology accepted, sir. Hartwick held her hand for a moment longer than necessary, his grip firm. You're going to go far in this Air Force, Captain Mitchell. That's not hope. That's certainty. He saluted. Sarah returned it. And somewhere in the watching crowd, someone began to clap, then another, then everyone. As the applause echoed across the tarmac, Sarah finally let herself feel it, not pride exactly, but something simpler. Vindication. The story spread like wildfire. By noon the next day, every pilot at Travis Air Force Base knew the details. The 75-knot crosswind, the zero visibility, the 40-degree crab angle, the impossible landing that should have ended in disaster but instead ended in triumph. By evening, the story had reached other Air Force bases across the country. By week's end, it had circulated through the entire military aviation community. Captain Sarah Mitchell had flown into legend. She slept for 14 hours after the mission, waking in her quarters disoriented and aching. When she finally checked her phone, she found 63 messages. Congratulations from former squadron mates. Questions from aviation journalists. A formal commendation notice from base command. And one text from Marcus. You're famous. Prepare yourself. He wasn't exaggerating. When Sarah entered the officers' mess 2 days later for breakfast, conversation stopped. Heads turned. Then Captain Richardson, who'd refused the Bagram mission, stood up from his table and began to applaud. Others joined him. Within seconds, the entire mess hall was on its feet, clapping. Sarah's face burned red. She nodded awkwardly and quickly got her coffee, retreating to a corner table. But the damage was done. She was no longer just another pilot. She was that pilot, the one who'd done the impossible. Not everyone celebrated. At a table near the back, Captain Tors leaned toward Major Kendrick. I still don't get why everyone's making such a big deal, Tors muttered. She got lucky. Right place, right time. Kendrick, who'd also declined the mission, didn't respond. He stared into his eggs, remembering the moment he'd said no, the moment he'd chosen safety over duty. 7 soldiers owed their lives to someone braver than him. The silence at their table spoke volumes. What surprised Sarah most was Colonel Hartwick. The man who'd spent 3 months questioning her every move became her fiercest advocate overnight. It started small, a nod of approval in the corridor, a compliment during a briefing, but it grew. 2 weeks after the Bagram mission, Hartwick called Sarah to his office. She entered cautiously, still not entirely trusting this new dynamic. Sit, Captain. Hartwick gestured to a chair. His office was Spartan, military awards on one wall, photos of aircraft on another. He sat behind his desk, looking older somehow, more weathered. I've been doing some thinking, he began. About my career, about my prejudices, about what happened with you. He paused, choosing words carefully. I spent 30 years believing I knew what made a great pilot, physical strength, aggression, a certain profile, and I was convinced that anyone outside that profile was there because of politics, not merit. Sarah remained silent, letting him speak. You proved me wrong in the most definitive way possible. Hartwick pulled out a folder. I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. I'm also nominating you for advanced command training at the Air Force Weapons School, and I'm writing a letter to Air Force Personnel Command recommending your early promotion to major." Sarah's eyes widened. "Sir, Let me finish." Hartwick held up a hand. "I can't undo 3 months of doubt and dismissiveness. I can't give you back the routine missions and excessive scrutiny, but I can do this. I can make sure that what you accomplished and what you overcame to accomplish it is recognized at the highest levels." He slid the folder across the desk. Sarah opened it, seeing draft recommendation letters, commendation forms, training nominations, all for her. "Why?" she asked quietly. Hartwick leaned back in his chair. "Because excellence deserves recognition, regardless of where it comes from. And because if I don't learn from my mistakes, then I'm not the officer I thought I was." Sarah looked at the man across the desk, this colonel who'd laughed when she entered the cockpit, who'd given her milk runs while assigning complex missions to less experienced pilots. He'd been wrong, and admitting it clearly cost him something. "Thank you, sir," she said. "This means more than you know." Hartwick nodded. "Just promise me something, Captain." "Sir?" "When you're in my position someday, when you're the senior officer making decisions about junior pilots, remember what it felt like to be doubted. Remember what it took to prove yourself. And don't make the same mistakes I did." The months that followed transformed Travis Air Force Base in subtle but significant ways. Sarah received the complex missions now: disaster relief to earthquake zones, VIP transport to conflict regions, high-priority cargo to forward operating bases. Every mission she flew with the same meticulous precision that had defined her entire career. Perfect landings, flawless navigation, textbook procedures. But something else changed too. The younger pilots, especially the women, began seeking her out. Lieutenant Jennifer Park, fresh from flight training, nervously approached Sarah in the pilot briefing room one morning. "Captain Mitchell, could I ask you something?" Sarah looked up from her flight plan. "Of course." "How do you handle it? The doubt, I mean. I'm the only woman in my squadron and some of the guys." She trailed off, but Sarah understood perfectly. "You handle it by being undeniable," Sarah said simply. "You be so good, so precise, so professional that doubt becomes irrelevant. Not everyone will respect you immediately. Some never will. But the ones who matter, the ones who value skill over stereotypes, they'll come around." Park nodded, absorbing this. "The Bagram landing, everyone talks about it like it was superhuman. Were you scared?" "Terrified," Sarah admitted. "But fear and capability aren't mutually exclusive. You can be afraid and still do what needs to be done. That's not courage despite fear, that's courage because of it." These conversations became regular. Young pilots, male and female, sought Sarah's mentorship. She found herself explaining not just flying techniques but the psychology of proving yourself, of maintaining excellence under scrutiny, of staying focused when others wanted you to fail. Marcus, now her regular co-pilot, watched these interactions with satisfaction. "You're building something here," he told her one evening. "Not just flying missions, building a legacy." 20 months after the Bagram mission, the promotion came through. Major Sarah Mitchell. The ceremony was standard: formal uniforms, symbolic pinning of new rank, congratulatory handshakes. But when Colonel Hartwick pinned on her new insignia, he whispered something only she could hear. "This is just the beginning, Major. Don't stop here." She wouldn't. The Air Force Weapons School acceptance letter had arrived that same week. Advanced tactical training, the most prestigious aviation program in the military. Of the 40 pilots selected, Sarah was one of only 3 women. Some things changed slowly. But at her promotion ceremony, Sarah looked around at the assembled crowd. Pilots who doubted her, commanders who'd questioned her, young aviators who saw her as proof that barriers could be broken. Even Captain Torres was there, his expression no longer dismissive but thoughtful. The Bagram landing had been one moment, one mission, one impossible feat, but its ripples continued to spread, changing attitudes, opening doors, proving that excellence transcended gender, background, or prejudice. 6 months later, Major Sarah Mitchell reported to the Air Force Weapons School and excelled again, graduating third in her class. And when she returned to Travis, it was with new orders: instructor pilot, advanced cargo operations. She would train the next generation. On her first day, Sarah stood before a classroom of 24 student pilots, 12 men, 12 women, all of them young, eager, uncertain. "My name is Major Sarah Mitchell," she began. "Some of you may have heard stories about a landing I made at Bagram. Those stories are mostly true, though they've gotten more dramatic with each retelling." Scattered laughter. "But that one landing isn't why I'm standing here today. I'm here because of 3,000 other flights, routine cargo runs, milk runs, boring missions that nobody remembers. Excellence isn't built in one dramatic moment. It's built in countless small ones when nobody's watching, when the mission doesn't matter, when you could cut corners but don't." She looked at each face, seeing herself reflected back. The determination, the hope, the fear of not being good enough. "Some of you will face doubt," she continued. "People will question whether you belong in a cockpit. They'll scrutinize you more carefully than others. They'll wait for you to fail. That's reality, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest." She paused, letting that sink in. "But here's what I learned. Doubt from others is only powerful if you doubt yourself. Be undeniable. Be excellent. Be so consistently good that doubt becomes irrelevant." A young woman in the front row, her name tag read Chen, raised her hand. "Major Mitchell, what if being excellent isn't enough? What if they still don't respect you?" Sarah smiled, remembering Colonel Hartwick's laugh in the hangar, his dismissal, his eventual transformation. "Then you keep being excellent anyway," she said. "Not for them, for yourself, for the mission, for the 7 soldiers bleeding out on a tarmac somewhere who need you to be brave enough to fly into hell." The classroom was silent. "Now," Sarah said, pulling up a flight simulation on the screen, "let's talk about crosswind landing techniques, because someday when everything is on the line, you'll need to know this, and I'm going to make sure you do." As the lesson began, Sarah felt something settle in her chest: purpose, clarity, the satisfaction of passing hard-won knowledge to those who would follow. She'd proven herself in the sky. Now she'd prove herself on the ground, building the next generation of pilots who would face their own impossible moments. And when they did, they'd be ready. 3 years after the Bagram landing, Major Sarah Mitchell stood in the observation tower at Nellis Air Force Base, watching her student attempt a challenging crosswind landing. The wind was gusting to 40 knots, not Bagram-level catastrophic, but enough to test any pilot's skill. Lieutenant Jennifer Chen was at the controls, and Sarah could see the C-17 crabbing at a steep angle on final approach, fighting the desert winds. Sarah's hands unconsciously mimicked the control inputs she knew Chen should be making. Old habits. "She's too high," Captain Marcus Webb said beside her. Now a senior instructor himself, Marcus had become Sarah's closest colleague and friend. "She needs to drop another 100 feet. "She knows," Sarah replied calmly. "Watch." Chen corrected precisely, the massive aircraft descending smoothly. At 50 feet, she performed the exact maneuver Sarah had taught her, straightening the nose while leveling the wings in one fluid motion. The main gear touched down perfectly on centerline. "Textbook," Marcus breathed. "You've trained her well." Sarah smiled. "She did the work, I just showed her it was possible." Over the past 3 years, Sarah had trained 63 pilots in advanced cargo operations. 12 had been women. All of them carried forward the lessons she'd learned through years of proving herself: excellence through precision, respect through undeniable skill, barriers broken through consistent performance. But the impact went far beyond her classroom. The Bagram landing had become legendary in military aviation. It was studied in flight schools as an example of exceptional airmanship under impossible conditions. Aviation journals had published detailed analyses of her approach and landing technique. The Air Force had produced a training video examining her decision-making process. Captain Sarah Mitchell, the woman Colonel Hartwick had laughed at, had become synonymous with excellence. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. "Major Mitchell, this is Lieutenant General Patricia Morrison from Air Mobility Command." The voice on the phone was crisp, authoritative. "I'm calling to inform you that you've been selected for promotion to Lieutenant Colonel, effective immediately. Congratulations." Sarah sat down slowly. Lieutenant Colonel. At 37 years old, she was one of the youngest officers in Air Mobility Command to achieve that rank. "Thank you, ma'am," she managed. "I'm honored." "You've earned it, Mitchell. Your training record is exemplary, your mission success rate is perfect, and your leadership has transformed how we approach cargo operations. You're exactly what the Air Force needs." Morrison paused. "How would you feel about a command position? We're looking for someone to take over the 60th Air Mobility Wing at Travis." Travis, where it had all begun, where she'd been doubted, dismissed, and ultimately vindicated. "I'd be honored, General." "Excellent, your orders will be cut within the week. And Mitchell, there's someone at Travis who specifically requested this assignment for you." 2 weeks later, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell walked into the same hangar where Colonel Hartwick had laughed at her 4 years earlier. The space looked exactly the same. Massive C-17s, mechanics working, the smell of jet fuel and possibility. But everything was different. A formation of pilots stood at attention, waiting to meet their new commanding officer. Among them were faces she recognized: Richardson, Torres, Kendrick, now senior captains themselves, and new faces, younger pilots who knew her only by reputation. At the front of the formation stood Colonel James Hartwick. He'd requested to be present for her assumption of command, delaying his own retirement by 2 weeks specifically for this moment. Now 71 years old, with decades of service behind him, he stood straight and proud as Sarah approached. "Formation attention," Marcus called out. Everyone snapped to position. Sarah walked down the line, inspecting her new command. When she reached Hartwick, he saluted crisply. She returned it, then extended her hand. "Thank you for being here, sir." "Wouldn't miss it, Colonel." He emphasized her new rank. "This is the proudest moment of my career." After the ceremony, after the formalities and speeches, Hartwick asked Sarah to walk with him to one of the C-17s parked on the tarmac. They stood in the shadow of its massive wing, 2 officers at different ends of their careers. "I'm retiring in 3 days," Hartwick said. 45 years of service, countless missions, hundreds of pilots under my command." He looked up at the aircraft. "But you know what I'll be remembered for." Sarah waited. The colonel who laughed when the best pilot he'd ever meet walked into his hangar. Hartwick's voice was thick with emotion. "That's my legacy, Mitchell, not my combat missions or my command experience. The fact that I almost let prejudice blind me to greatness." "Sir." "Let me finish." Hartwick turned to face her. "You changed me. Not just my opinion about women in aviation, but my entire understanding of what leadership means. Real leaders recognize talent wherever it comes from. They don't let preconceptions dictate reality. You taught this old dog that lesson, and I'm grateful for it." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small box. "This was my father's. He flew B-17s in World War II. It's been passed down through 3 generations of Hartwick pilots." He opened the box, revealing vintage pilot wings, tarnished silver, worn from decades of wear. "I want you to have them. Not because you need them, you've earned your own wings 100 times over, but because you represent what my father believed in, that courage, skill, and dedication are all that matter in the cockpit, nothing else." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She took the wings carefully, feeling their weight, their history. "I'll treasure these, sir, always." "I know you will." Hartwick saluted one final time. "It's been an honor, Colonel Mitchell, give him hell." That evening, Sarah stood in her new office, the same office Hartwick had occupied when he doubted her. She'd rearranged nothing yet. His award still hung on the wall, his personal effects still cluttered the desk. But one addition sat on the corner of the desk now, Hartwick's father's pilot wings, mounted in a small frame. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Lieutenant Chen stood in the doorway, nervous excitement on her face. "Ma'am, I just got my orders. I'm being assigned to Special Operations Command. They want me to fly infiltration missions into hostile territory." Sarah smiled. "That's incredible, Chen, you've earned it." "Ma'am, I wouldn't be here without you. When I started flight training, my instructor told me women weren't built for military aviation, that we didn't have the instincts. I almost quit." Chen's voice cracked slightly. "Then I heard about the Bagram landing, about you, and I realized he was wrong." "He was wrong," Sarah confirmed. "But you proved it, not me. You put in the hours, mastered the skills, exceeded the standards. That was all you." "Yes, ma'am, but you showed me it was possible." After Chen left, Sarah sat alone in the quiet office. She thought about Oklahoma, about her father's crop duster, about the 7-year-old girl who'd known her destiny the first time she'd sat in a cockpit. She thought about every doubter, every dismissal, every time she'd had to be perfect just to be considered adequate. And she thought about the pilots she'd trained, the barriers that had fallen, the slow but inevitable change she'd helped create. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Drinks at the O Club to celebrate. Everyone's asking for the new commander." Sarah smiled and typed back, "On my way." She stood, straightening her uniform, touching the vintage wings on her desk one more time. Then she walked out of the office, turning off the lights behind her. The hangar was quiet now, the massive C-17s resting like sleeping giants. Sarah paused at the entrance, looking at the aircraft she'd devoted her life to flying. The same type of aircraft she'd landed in impossible conditions, proving that skill knew no gender. Tomorrow she'd lead this wing. Tomorrow she'd train more pilots, fly more missions, break more barriers. But tonight, she'd celebrate with the colleagues who'd become friends, in the same officers' club where she'd once been excluded from conversations. As Sarah walked across the tarmac, she heard voices behind her, young pilots discussing flight techniques, arguing good-naturedly about the best approach to crosswind landings. Among them, she heard a woman's voice, confident and clear, explaining a technical point. Sarah smiled. The cockpit door that had once seemed closed was now wide open, not just for her, but for everyone who would follow. Every woman who'd been told she wasn't built for this. Every person who'd faced doubt and dismissed it through excellence. The barriers weren't completely gone. Prejudice and skepticism still existed, but they were crumbling, one perfect landing at a time, one trained pilot at a time, one proved assumption at a time. And somewhere in the darkness, if she listened carefully, Sarah could almost hear the sound of laughter. Not the dismissive kind from 4 years ago, but the warm, genuine kind that came from pilots who'd earned each other's respect. She'd proven them wrong. She'd proven herself right. And in doing so, she'd proven that the sky belonged to anyone brave enough, skilled enough, and determined enough to claim it. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell walked into the officers' club, where her squadron waited to celebrate. The girl from Oklahoma had come a long way, and she was just getting started. The end.